One of the arguments you hear a lot in the debate over gender ideology across the political spectrum is that adults should be able to do what they want. This is the supposedly moderate position. Several presidential candidates believe it. Millions of Americans believe it too. As long as you stay away from the kids, they tell you, then there's no problem. The moment you hit 18 years old, do what you want. Live your truth. It's not hard to see why that position is tempting for some people. Children obviously can't consent to life-altering procedures, including genital mutilation and castration, especially those. Adults, on the other hand, are able to consent to a lot of things. They can buy guns, they can vote, they can serve in the military. So if they want to pay a doctor to carve up their bodies, then what's the big deal? That's the argument you hear again and again. No one really means it, though. And you know that no one means it because none of the people making that argument would use that same reasoning to justify, say, lobotomies. If you walked into a doctor's office today and asked him to drill a hole in your head and sever your prefrontal cortex in order to make you feel better about your life, he would say no. And if he did it, he would go to prison. No amount of informed consent, no matter how old you were, could possibly justify it. It's barbaric. Tens of thousands of people's lives were ruined by lobotomies. And everybody recognizes that now. Nobody's marching in defense of lobotomy-affirming care. So if you defend these gruesome, quote-unquote, gender-affirming procedures on adults, you're not really saying that adults should be able to do what they want. You're saying that, yes, people can change their sex if they want. You're conceding that these procedures, slicing up a woman's arm to make a fake penis, lopping off healthy breasts, grafting fake nipples onto patients' chests, etc., are medically reasonable. And in the absence of any kind of statistical data about positive long-term outcomes of these surgeries, you're trusting the doctors to follow an established standard of care. You're assuming that they're not going to just mutilate anyone who walks in the door without regard for what happens to these people afterwards. The problem is that the entire industry of gender-affirming care is a scam. The whole thing. And we know that because we just spent weeks investigating the largest providers of so-called trans healthcare in the country. We went undercover at one of them. And what we found is that there are no real standards of care governing any of this. To be clear, there are standards of care, quote unquote, on paper, and they're provided by the transgender activist group WPATH. WPATH standards are used by major hospitals in this country, including UCLA, UCSF, Mass General, just to name a few. How rigorous are these standards exactly? Well, after a 22-minute video call, the largest trans healthcare provider in the country, carefully following the WPATH guidelines, approved one of my producers, Greg Ray, for an orchiectomy. That means testicle removal. Now, 22 minutes would be a record time to get approved for an orchiectomy if you had a real medical reason for it, like testicular cancer. It's insane to approve any serious procedure that quickly, having just met a patient in a video call for the first time, but that's what happened. And we recorded the whole call. At no point did anyone at this healthcare provider, which is called Plume, push back in any way. They didn't suggest that maybe this was a rash course of action. They didn't verify any of the information Greg provided, including his fake name that he gave them. All Plume did was insist that he pay $150. If Greg did that, they promised to write him a medically sound letter in support of life-altering surgery. That letter, under the WPATH standards, is required for anyone trying to get transgender surgery in the United States. You have to get one of these letters from a healthcare provider and then present it to your surgeon. And Plume rubber-stamped Greg's letter in 22 minutes. And not all that time was spent discussing the surgery, by the way. Some of the conversation was about traffic and the weather. As I speak, we've uploaded footage of the call on Twitter. You can watch it there right now. In a moment, we'll show you parts of it. In this video call, Greg assumed the name Chelsea Bussey. He didn't dress up as a woman. He didn't wear any women's clothing or makeup or any of that. He didn't go to Party City and dye his hair blue. He just told them he identified as a woman and that he was taking hormones prescribed by his father. Greg couldn't even pronounce the name of the surgery he wanted. He called it an orchidectomy. He claimed at one point that the reason he wanted the surgery is that it would speed up his non-existent transition, which the Plume nurse said didn't make any sense from a medical perspective, but none of that raised any red flags for Plume. The nurse told Greg she wanted to write him the strongest letter she could anyway. Watch.
So you're currently on estrogen. You're taking 6 milligrams a day.
Twice a day. Yeah, right. You got it.
So you're taking 1.5 tablets today? Okay. And then, I guess, the system, significant history. All right. Okay, so let's kind of get into this a little bit. So you are seeking what surgery? Things that are of course you probably know things that are irreversible when it comes to estrogen-based therapy is breast development and testicular shrinkage, right? But there's always a possibility for hair growth to come back. That may change with orchiectomy. Once you stop, once you don't no longer have your testes, you no longer have the ability for your teeth to convert to BHT because you don't have as much teeth, right? So hair growth, facial and body hair may change after orchiectomy. Fat redistribution is affected by the estrogen. So you may have less of a change in fat redistribution if you ever stop eating, but it may change as a whole. So it kind of does have a benefit without the spironolactone, but you still probably would definitely want to take estrogen as long as you would like.
I'm not complaining about the daily pills, just to be clear. I'm just saying if it accelerates it and makes things faster, then that's better.
Give me a little bit of history with your gender dysphoria. That may kind of help me. I want to make this letter as solid as possible to be like, this orchiectomy is definitely needed.
I'll tell you, I'm happy to. So when I was in school, and I actually wrote a big essay for admission to a club about how I didn't feel like my biological sex went along with how I felt, and I told people that, and they thought it was ridiculous. So because they thought I just look like a guy, so they like this is ridiculous.
Now, a couple of days after that discussion, as we document on Twitter, Plume sent Greg a letter diagnosing him with significant and ongoing gender dysphoria. Therefore, Plume said he was an appropriate candidate for orchiectomy. According to Plume, testicle removal would help Greg make significant progress in alleviating his dysphoria. Now, even after Greg followed up with text messages to Plume explaining that he doesn't have dysphoria, they didn't retract or amend that letter in any way. There's no excuse for that, obviously. Plume had multiple opportunities to tell the truth in their letter, and they chose not to. In his intake form, Greg indicated he didn't have dysphoria for 6 months or more. Didn't have it. That means under the current version of the DSM, he never should have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the first place. But Plume never once asked Greg about this in his video interview. Instead, they just said that he had dysphoria in the letter, which they intended to be used by a surgeon who would then carve up Greg's testicles. Why didn't Plume amend the letter once they were made aware that Greg didn't have dysphoria? As Plume's nurse explained, in order for the surgery to be paid for, quote unquote, the diagnosis would need to remain. In other words, insurance companies won't pay for the operation unless the letter contains a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, so they're going to put that diagnosis in there regardless. That's why Plume uses templates that include the gender dysphoria diagnostic code. It appears very much so that they plug whatever information patients feed them into this generic template, whether or not those patients actually have the diagnosis. The templates are provided by WPATH, by the way, and Plume admitted that to us. Are you tired of breathing in polluted air in the comfort of your own home and want to safeguard your family's health and well-being? Well, with our new friends at EnviroCleanse, you'll never have to worry again. EnviroCleanse is an in-home air purifying unit designed to destroy cold and flu viruses, allergy-inflaming toxins, mold, and even more. With EnviroCleanse, they promise far fewer colds, allergies, and better sleep. They even give you a free air quality monitor to test the difference in your own home. EnviroCleanse sent us our own unit with having 6 kids and a wife. The last thing any of us need is to get sick, because once one person gets sick, it tears through the whole house and ruins our week. My kids want to be outside all summer long, and thanks to EnviroCleanse, we don't have to worry about getting sick. Their air purifiers come in all sizes, colors, and prices to fit every budget. They offer additional products like surface cleaner and laundry detergent so you can stay protected in every aspect of your home. Breathe in pure air and live a healthier life. Visit ekpure.com and use code Walsh for 10% off your EnviroCleanse home air purification unit. Right now, you'll also get their free air quality monitor plus fast, free shipping. That's a $150 savings. ekpure.com, code Walsh. That's ekpure.com, promo code Walsh. It's not hard to conclude that this operation is fraudulent. But what do insurers think of it? What does Aetna and United Health think of it? What's their position on paying for surgeries based on cooked up diagnostic codes? What about Cigna? We understand those insurance companies work directly with Plume. What about David Sachs, whose venture capital firm is one of the many that's funding Plume? What are his thoughts on this? Is he aware this is happening? Those are good questions. But the problem is much bigger than Plume. That's what you have to understand. They're far from the only ones doing this. Folx, Folx, for example, is a major competitor of Plume. They're in almost every state in the country. They're also extremely well funded by venture capitalists. Folks like Plume also sells letters that authorize surgeries under the WPATH guidelines. On their website, Folks admits, and I'm quoting, "It's quite possible that the information in a letter may not be specific to you. For example, they may use a gender dysphoria diagnosis, but you really do not have dysphoria. You may not fit this diagnostic code exactly, but in some cases the code is needed in order for insurers to pay for the surgery." Now, we reached out to folks to ask them about this, and they confirmed that a diagnosis, which they put in scare quotes, was necessary in order for insurance companies to pay out. So that's why they put it in there. Again, that's probably news to the insurance companies, but the bigger issue, of course, is what's happening to the patients who are mutilated as part of this process. It's not just Plume and Folks who are authorizing surgeries like this. There's a whole network of doctors who crank out these letters. It's called the Gender Affirmative Letter Access Project, or GALLOP. Think of the lives that these doctors and these companies are destroying for profit. Listen, if they will approve Greg for castration in 22 minutes after he said he doesn't have dysphoria, they will approve anyone. I mean, anyone. Many of the luminaries in the field will admit that, by the way. On Twitter, we highlighted this training session from the Juniper Center, which is one of the largest gender therapy practices in the Chicagoland area. I want you to watch as the licensed clinical social worker named Ari Groner explains that she'll rubber stamp whatever letter patients want. She says she'll even authorize a suicidal patient for surgery because she's not a gatekeeper. In fact, Groner says that if her patient is suicidal, that would make the case even stronger for surgery. Listen to this.
Any psych history that might be helpful to sort of showing the necessity. So if, let's say, a client has a psych history that includes like suicidal ideation or a suicide attempt, and you can connect it to the gender dysphoria, that actually can be sort of a positive, persuasive essay piece. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Because you can kind of show what this is so necessary, right? This is how this is impacting this person's life, and this is why this procedure is necessary and needed. I have found that when I frame it in we're going to kind of use this as a persuasive essay, and we're going to really, kind of stick it to them, there's a little bit more fun with it in the way we even use language. So I found that to kind of be helpful with clients and who's asking us to write these letters. So oftentimes we're being asked by surgeons or physicians, but in reality, it's really for the insurance companies. That's what the letters are really for. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. We have to use the DSM in our letters for insurance company. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. As y'all can tell, I'm not like the biggest DSM fan. So I just think it's important to highlight because of this requirement. And this is something I'll explain to the client. So I'll talk about, your insurance company is saying as, or sort of a requirement for this letter, for the surgery, that you have to have this diagnosis. And we'll kind of talk about that. So knowing that this, sort of American Psychological Association, or DSM, there's this history of pathologizing and categorizing queer people as sort of sexual deviants, there is that minimal trust. So what I talk about is that we're using the diagnosis to ensure that clients get that necessary treatment.
So these are letters that are necessary to approve life-altering mutilation procedures. And the people responsible for the letters, in this case, this woman, describing them as persuasive essays that she has fun with. Now, if you're defending gender-affirming care, quote unquote, for adults, this is what you're supporting. You are saying that it's reasonable for medical professionals to listen to a suicidal patient who isn't thinking clearly and approve them for surgical castration within minutes. You're saying there should be no barriers to this kind of mutilation whatsoever. At that point, why not bring back lobotomies? What's the serious principled argument against it? No serious person can defend this industry. It's completely corrupted at every level. It's not just targeting children, although it's certainly doing that as well. The underlying claims and promises of the entire gender-affirming industry are lies, and they are lies propped up by even more lies, as we just showed you. And we'll have much more on WPATH soon, by the way, and how they became so prominent in this field. It's a truly disturbing story. Their supposedly rigorous standards of care are purpose-built to be manipulated, as we've now revealed. A lot more on that. The practical effect of these WPATH standards isn't to protect patients. Instead, the WPATH standards protect doctors who butcher their patients. These doctors understand that they need to follow some kind of standard of care, quote unquote, or else they'll eventually get sued into the ground for malpractice by the patients they're disfiguring. So medical providers point to the WPATH standards and say, look, we follow the standards. These gruesome surgeries are in fact legitimate medical care. Now it's time to put an end to this. Insurance companies should cut off these providers. Investors should stop funding this barbarism. And at the political level, we need laws so that any doctor who mutilates patients or lies to insurance companies goes to prison, regardless of the patient's age. Florida recently passed a law outlawing, among other things, trans telehealth services that require in-person visits for most of these procedures. That's a start, which is why the media and trans activists are furious about it. They're probably going to sue to block that portion of the law, just like they blocked the part of the law outlawing child castration yesterday. But once people see the truth about what's happening, the radical gender activists won't win that fight. That's why we published our investigation today. The truth is obvious and undeniable. Now that the standards of care have been exposed for what they are, there's nothing to stop a flood of lawsuits that could shut down these butchers. We saw it in the UK with Tavistock. If something like that happens here, it could save tens of thousands of lives. That's why this investigation is just one part of what we have planned for Pride Month. We're going to expose the full extent of the depravity that you're told and insisted that you must believe is medically legitimate. We're going to show you the truth behind all the euphemisms. We're going to reveal how exactly activists have managed to hijack the medical profession so they can mutilate patients for profit. And this is just the beginning. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.